So I know that last week, Olas was here and spoke to you all about covenant, exploring what it might mean to take seriously the implicit and explicit covenants we make with not only other humans, but also the earth and the creatures who share it with us. This week, as we continue to think about what special tools our Unitarian Universalism offers us for our journey through these lives of ours, I am slated to speak about the principles, and I will. Next week, I'm going to talk about the sources, and I will do that. But I had a realization when I was thinking about this week. Maybe more properly stated, a renewed truth arose in me, which is that all of these things, covenant, principles, and sources, are inextricably linked. They form the foundation of what we are as a faith. And it's why at the end of the affirmation of the principles and sources, you can find it actually in the hymnal on that very first page. At the end of the principles and sources, the following phrase occurs: "Grateful for the religious pluralism which enriches and ennobles our faith, we are inspired to deepen our understanding and expand our vision. As free congregations, we enter into this covenant, promising to one another our mutual trust and support." The principles and sources are themselves something of a covenant, a set of shared promises about how we want to be. So this morning, as we begin the conversation, what I'm actually going to do is read to you again the covenant that we, the Unitarian Society of Ridgewood, approved this past June. We don't read it probably as often as we should, so I'm going to read it to you this morning. Led by our shared Unitarian Universalist values, committed to the search for truth, meaning, and justice, and determined to create a community of trust, warmth, and joy, together with love we covenant to support this congregation with our presence, gifts, and service, and to care for each other and the long-term well-being of our community, to listen deeply to one another in a spirit of openness, acceptance, and trust, to speak and act with forethought, honesty, and compassion, considering not only the intent, but also the impact of our words and behaviors, to speak directly whenever possible to those with whom we have disagreements, and to encourage others to do the same, seeking assistance from leadership as necessary, to include all people with gratitude for the differences among us, celebrating the richness of varied perspectives, to attend intentionally to dynamics of oppression and prejudice in our interactions with each other and in our congregational system, to participate in congregational votes and decisions, engaging in thoughtful dissent and respecting our democratic processes, to ask for and to extend forgiveness to each other if we break these promises. And it ends with this: this covenant is a living document to which we can refer in our interactions with each other, reminding ourselves of our shared promises. It invites ongoing learning and courageous acts of love and reconciliation. Ours is a series of promises contained within the life of this congregation about how we will behave together and what our guiding lights will be: joy, warmth, trust, reconciliation, and love. It was with that tool packed in our bag that I came to the question of the principles for this week. And they're another thing we don't read that often here at USR. You will hear me reference them in sermons, but we don't often read the whole list out. And my not so secret truth is that I usually have to look them up to get the language right. Even as a lifelong Unitarian Universalist, I do not have them fully memorized. I usually end up going, oh, there's that one about democracy, something about conscience. 1, 4, and 7, I can do by heart, and 8, I'm learning now, but the rest, and there's kind of a reason for this, right? I'm definitely not the only one, The principles are explicitly not like something like the Nicene Creed, or like certain prayers or statements of faith in Judaism and Islam. They're not dogma. We don't ask our people to memorize them and recite them. We teach our children a simplified variation on the theme, not words handed down by gods and prophets that must be exact. We don't expect the principles to hold the kind of space in the hearts and minds and theology of UUs that other religions do certain of their texts. Fundamentally, we are non-creedal, of course, but beyond that, we don't understand the principles as fixed. They're meant to be reviewed every 15 years. Reviewed and then either reaffirmed or changed as befits the changing world and our changing faith. I've shared that with you before in the context of introducing the eighth principle, the newest proposed one, that we are supposed to review them every 15 years, but I think that we forget that often, and we kind of reify the principles, and we lose sight of the fact that ours is a living faith grounded in the notion that science and knowledge will expand, and so will our understanding of ourselves and our shared world. And so nothing really can be perfectly fixed. Everything is about growth and movement. Everything is alive and changing and becoming, including this thing we do called Unitarian Universalism. The principles were born some 60 years ago at the time of the merger, when the Unitarians and the Universalists decided to throw their lots in together. They each abandoned their previous theological dogma, although honestly, in both cases, much of it had already been dissipated and they'd become theologically open already. But then rather than trying to create a statement of faith that they could share and would insist on, they created 6 principles at the time that they felt reflected their shared values and aspirations. And those original 6 reflected a narrow understanding of gender, a deeper desire to evangelize, and totally absent was the notion of the interdependent web that so many of us find central to our world understanding. And it was in the 1980s that the principles were rewritten and that we got that 7th one, and we got language that was gender inclusive. So the principles already have changed with the times, taken shape as we have learned more about what the core values of Unitarianism and Universalism, unity and love, ask us to embody in this world. The very fact that they are not fixed may contribute to our collective lack of awareness or dismissal of them once we've had our initial, oh, that's me, I believe those things. And I'm just as guilty of this apathy as anyone. And I was thinking about today's service and shared with some colleagues that I was bored with talking about the principles. That is exactly the word I used. I said, I'm bored. And I probably shouldn't tell you that, but that's where I was, like early in the week. I was like, the principles again, oh. And then I remembered this phrase that I keep saying to my children: boredom is a failure of the imagination. The principles weren't the problem. My attitude and my limitations were the problem. My habit formed over 4 decades of thinking about them as simply a set of pleasant statements that we all sign on to. The great risk when we attempt not to reify them or make icons or dogma of them is that the principles kind of blend into the background. Like, how many times have I heard someone say, well, everyone can agree to the principles? They're basic ethical stances, not that hard to affirm and subscribe to. And on some level, that's true, right? Like on paper, if we treat them as just words, as notions that we're asked to consider lightly and then agree with or disagree with as a sort of litmus test as to whether we'll enjoy life in a UU congregation, maybe they're easy to adhere to. But what if we take them as more than words on a paper? I think that we can think of them as such, as more than just words, without moving into the idolatry of creed. If we actually take the principles seriously, we come to see them as a call to action. And if we treat them as living guideposts, and by that I mean both guideposts that themselves live and change, and as guideposts for our own living, then everything begins to change. Part of what is interesting and tricky is that it is easier to think of them as lofty ideals out there, aspirational. Bringing them into our lives in meaningful ways brings them into the realm of theology, of deep belief and commitment. Many, many years ago, my internship mentor said to me that talking about theology, about the things that we most deeply believe, is vulnerable, intimate work, more so than folks tend to realize. She said to me that when we talk about what moves us in this world, when we engage deeply in honest conversations about what matters most to us and why, how we live up to and fall short of the truths that call us, it feels risky. So it's easier to say, oh yeah, I agree with these ethical, philosophical statements, but it isn't enough. It takes trust to do that deeper work, and that's why the principles don't exist in a vacuum. They exist within a covenant of mutual trust and support. Because trust is the foundation of everything, and it isn't easy, but there is no other way. There is no easy way. At least, there's no easy way that will be satisfying, growth-filled, deepening, and meaning-making. I saw an image on Facebook earlier this week that I want to show you, so I'm going to ask Olas to share the screen with this image. So it's all over the internet. This one came specifically from Psychology Today. I was struck by this for many reasons, but in the way that sometimes the Spirit moves, in my mind, it connected to this realization I had about the principles. I think for the longest time, I have been happy to sit in my comfort zone with the principles. These feel good. They make me feel righteous and moral. But what would happen if I pushed myself into the fear zone or the learning zone, or, heaven forbid, even into the growth zone? It might look something like this. In our first principle, we covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Great. What if I push myself not only to believe this, but to practice it? It doesn't mean I have to love the guy who cuts me off in traffic, but maybe it does mean that I have to consider that perhaps something is happening in his life that has caused him to drive this way. It doesn't mean that I have to think a murderer should go free, but maybe it does mean that accountability and redemption take the forefront over punishment and revenge. It doesn't mean that I have to spend time with everyone I meet or want to spend time with everyone I meet, but maybe it does mean that I have to cultivate for them and offer to them a kind of universal love and care. In our second principle, we covenant to affirm and promote justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Is it enough to practice that here? Or perhaps, as is more often the case, is it enough to forego that here and only practice it at home or at work? Is it enough to vote with these values in mind, or do I need to be radically working toward a completely different world than the one we now inhabit? In our third principle, we covenant to affirm and promote acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. In my comfort zone, maybe I think all UUs think the same thing as I do about God or no God and about what this life means. But pushing myself further, I have to actually get comfortable with the idea that around me in our congregation and denomination are folks whose theology and spiritual growth are wildly different from mine. And it isn't enough to just be like, okay with it. I have to actually accept and encourage their growth. In our fourth principle, we covenant to affirm and promote a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. A lovely sentiment, but again, so often we stay light with it and we use it to justify our own searches, even if those searches edge from independent into individualistic and begin to derail community. we forget sometimes that responsible piece. And if we push ourselves, we come to see that we are called to mutually accountable searches, where the answers we find can't simply benefit us, but must work toward a common good. In our fifth principle, we covenant to affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. Each person gets a vote, but if we stretch ourselves, it's about more than getting a vote. It's about having a voice, a seat at the table. It's about actually listening to one another instead of listening in order to argue or dismiss. It doesn't require us to give equal credence to all positions. Some things are demonstrably false. Some positions are morally reprehensible. But within the realm of responsible and accountable and thoughtful sharing, it calls us to a certain kind of communication style. In our sixth principle, we covenant to affirm and promote the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Principle 6 relies on the aspirational language of our American political origins. If I move out of my comfort zone on this one, I have to acknowledge that around this wide world, the majority of folks know not peace, not liberty, and not justice. I have to acknowledge that even in my own backyard, whole identity groups are denied these fundamental rights, and that my complacency in that means I'm not pushing myself into something deeper. In our seventh principle, we covenant to affirm and promote respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. It's my favorite. This identifies the interdependent nature of our existence and includes within our family and support and accountability system all of existence, this earth and its creatures, in addition to the humans we normally understand ourselves to be in community with. And good gracious, if we pushed ourselves here, we would be rethinking what we eat, how we heat and cool our homes, the cars we drive, the vacations we take, the very way we live every single day. In our eighth principle, affirmed by this congregation last June, we covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. That one is a doozy, because in my comfort zone, yes, I am anti-racist, I believe in beloved community, and in my fear zone, my learning zone, and my growth zone, I suddenly have to acknowledge the nuances and complexities of a history and system that I'm part of, and whose far-reaching tentacles I cannot escape. I have to alter my language, my assumptions, my self-view, all of it. Now, not for nothing have I thought over the years that if we actually lived by our principles, really took them to their furthest, truest, deepest point, basically everything about how we live, from the way we spend our money and our time, to the way we think about ourselves, to the way we think about our accountability, everything would shift. If we really lived them, pushed ourselves, stopped looking at them as nice, lowest common denominator statements, if we actually heard these promises with fresh ears, we would find, I think, not boredom, but a whole new way of life. If we actually said them and meant them and heard them and understood them and the life they call us to, I actually think it would change everything. And also, not for nothing, have I thought over the years that that is a very big ask. Take this thing that is not fixed, is not gospel, can change, and use it to change completely and reorder your life. Don't fit these ideas in and around the lifestyle you have and want. Use these deep commitments to craft a life you can be proud of and be fulfilled by. Recently, I shared with the Board of Trustees a video of this comedian and commentator, Jay Smooth. He's addressing racism in it, but he makes this sort of corollary point, one that's going to be familiar to you. He makes the point that perfection is the enemy of the good. that trying to take the easy way will land us with a less meaningful, less fulfilling life and will cause us to miss opportunities for deep and real connection. And so too, insisting on perfection or nothing will cause us to stop trying to improve. So there's somewhere between reading the principles and then putting them over to the side and lifting them into static dogma that we slavishly adhere to. There's that living guidepost notion, aware that they are a moving target, aware that our lives are complex, and our ability to lean more or less into one or more of the principles will change over time, aware that the principles themselves will shift and grow with us. We have to constantly remind ourselves, check ourselves against these covenantal promises we have made to each other and to the world, because that is what we've done. We've made promises. When we commit ourselves here to this community and this faith, we aren't lightly accepting membership in a social club. We're agreeing to the intimate and vulnerable work of learning who we are, of sharing our beliefs and values, of trusting ourselves and each other. We're agreeing to covenant in all of these different ways. And if you've been around USR the last 4+ years and have listened to me, you may know by now that even back behind the principles and the covenant, I believe we share something, an inheritance from our theological forebears, the beacons that light the way for those guideposts, if you will. Love and oneness. I'm sure that sounds familiar. Undergirding our covenants and our principles is the deeply held and shared belief that we are part of something larger than ourselves, however we might define that, some great unity of existence and being, and that what redeems that existence, what changes it, enlivens it, perpetuates it, saves it, suffuses it, is love. Oneness and love are the silent background to all those words in our UUA covenant of principles and sources. Ever and always, we have to be attentive to the words and to the silences, and we have to find the way forward that is for us authentic, vulnerable, intimate, and courageous. May we find that way together, taking along this journey our shared beliefs and our shared promises. So may it be.